Okay, we are live. Hello, the three people watching. This is another installment of the Pale Galilean, and as you can see from the title, we're going to be talking about slavery today, and I wanted to do this for a few reasons. On my subscription feeds on YouTube, at least a few times that came up, there's always Christian apologists, most notably of the Protestant variety, that are trying to argue against the idea of biblical chattel slavery. One in particular, Thomas Hollweg, has apparently authored an entire book on the subject, attempting to defeat it and completely debunk it. Another Christian apologist, which is much more how would I say, another Christian apologist, which is much more prevalent and popular, is Frank Turek. And he himself has made various videos attempting to justify, or I might just say sanitize, the slavery we see clearly within the Hebrew Bible. Oh, hey, Diego, what's going on there, buddy? And it is within that that's within that respect and within that framework, I want to do this live stream, because slavery, chattel slavery, debt slavery, and yes, even sex slavery is within the pages of the Hebrew Bible. And nobody needs to like this, but it does need to be accepted. This is something we find within the Torah. This is something we find in the commands of God. And even though the latter is a distinction we make today that the ancients didn't make, regardless, this is an issue we need to confront and we need to be honest about ourselves on. Because as one of my, I think his name is one of my favorite YouTubers, who is also one of my favorite scholars, as Dr. Joshua Sledge says, that when we lie to ourselves, we both betray we both betray history and our own faith. And hey, Diego. Anyway, with that being said, I'm going to be sharing my screen for a few videos, and we're going to be addressing those in length, and they're going to be length of various time, you might say, and not only time but also caliber of interlocutor. The first one we're going to see is someone who goes by the name, I think, Pastor Nelson. I'm going to check that for sure. Yeah, Pastor Nelson. And he seems to be an adjunct employee of gotquestions.org. What credentials, scholarships he actually has, what education he has is not actually listed that I know of. So we're first going to go on the video he does for gotquestions.com. I have not watched that video, so my reactions to that are going to be very genuine. But it's also gotquestions.com, so I know it's going to be very relatively terrible. Then we're going to cover Canon Press by Doug Wilson. And Doug Wilson asks the question that Dr. Bowen asks in his book that I'll bring out over here in a bit. And Doug Wilson is, again, in my opinion, attempting to sanitize the Old Testament position of what slavery is. And when we're done with that, on the cherry on top, or not the cherry on top, but close to it, we're going to be going over Apologia. Apologia is reacting to a debate between, I think, Michael Sherman and Frank Turek. And it's going to be painful, not only because I don't often see eye to eye on Paulogia, but also because it's also Frank Turek. And finally, the last bit, I'm going to criticize one more person, and that's going to be Dr. Bowen himself. I got his book right here that arrived not too long ago, and I recommend everyone buy this book. It is an impressive work of scholarship, 700-page worth, lots of appendices, translations of ancient Assyrian and Babylonian steles that go into the commandments of what their God had commanded in kinds of slavery. And yeah, Joe, I don't know about what you're talking about Myth Vision. I'm aware Myth Vision exists. I'm aware he puts out videos. And I'm not too much of a fan of the people he has on. And the reason being is because it's really interesting because Derek Lambert, and for those of you that don't know, he runs Myth Vision podcast. Lambert claims that the people he has on are those of the most preeminent scholarship. They're the people that kind of represent mainstream scholarship on an issue. And I just don't necessarily believe that because I find it really odd how almost every scholar he has on, with the exception of Dr. Justin Sledge, who runs Esoterica, are people that are just patently atheist. And so when you have people that don't have any, when you have people that don't have any theistic underpinnings and have any understanding of like religiosity, I don't know if you could claim that the scholars you have on are actually representing all of scholarship, especially in the humanities, because you would be amazed how many professors of anthropology, archaeology, study of religion, philosophy, metaphysics, how many of these people are actually people of faith. You would be shocked to find out that people of faith quite populate these arenas. And it is these people that he invites that don't have that. And I find that very telling that for all of Lambert's claims, I don't think he's really inviting on people of all the scholarship that he could, just for that reason. And yeah, no, you're welcome, Joe. I hope I answered your question, and because I hope I did, unless you were referring to a particular video, because I'll just spill the beans here. There was a Myth Vision video that talked about the horrible. Well, I'm trying to remember this from memory. It was basically the horrible nature of the slavery of the Bible or something like that. It was released, I guess, a few months ago. And I'm just thinking, wow, Derek, slavery is that horrible that you keep continually financing it by buying the latest cameras and phones and streaming devices. Okay, yeah, sure. It must be really horrible. Anyway, with that being said, I've been rambling for the better part of probably 8 minutes at this point. So we are going to get right onto it. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go watch Got Confusion. Let me find the file here. That's no. There we go. Okay. Okay, so this has Got Confusion right here. And I'm wondering if I could do... Okay, we don't want that. We don't want that. I'm going to have to make do with this then. All right. Oh, hello. What's up, Diego? There is a former priest turned atheist named Edward Tart, who I think you should refute. He happens to be a good friend of the nefarious Brown Klansman. Now, that is interesting. It is rare that someone of the Catholic persuasion actually becomes an atheist, that are genuine confessional Catholics. And even much more rare that they were a priest. And so I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm really going to have to know who Edward Tart is, because there was another priest called Richard Bennett, who was a priest, and he never became an atheist, but he became a fundamentalist, diehard evangelical Christian, and became virulently anti-Catholic. And I have reason to believe that Mr. Bennett was never a Catholic, much less a Catholic priest, because he says things that are so incredibly dumb. There's no way he was ordained in that state of knowledge. And that's just my opinion. I could be completely wrong, but various things after his death, because he died now. He died in about 2017, 2018, a couple years ago. And things have come out about him since that really shed quite a bit of doubt on the idea that he was a priest at all. Because we have the evidence that he was a priest, I kid you not, is one photo that he has produced where he is wearing something that appears to be black clothing that a priest would wear. It doesn't have a cassock, right? It doesn't have an identifying mark of a Western priest, just pretty black clothing, and that's it. And color me shocked, but I'm going to need a bit more than that. Anyway, let's get started on this. And I'm going to do one thing here. For the first probably 10 seconds, I'm going to unmute another video I have going, which is going to be the current live stream. I need to know how my audio sounds while talking over.
Today's question is, does the Bible condone
So how
slavery?
do I sound?
In this video,
How do I sound? I sound pretty good. Let's go. All right. Of course, everybody, let me know if there's going to be any audio problems on your ends. I'll be paying as close attention to the chat as I can.
I'll answer that question from a biblical perspective. Then afterwards, as always, I'll share some helpful resources, so stick around until the end.
Okay, so here's the thing. I need to pause within 15 seconds, but I do. When Got Questions Ministry says we're going to give something from a biblical perspective, what they really mean is we will answer this in the most superficial way we can and whitewash it when it becomes uncomfortable. That's what they mean. I mean, anybody that's watched God Question Ministries as a knowledgeable Christian, as a knowledgeable lay Christian, much less as a scholar or academic, knows that their website is a hot mess. Like, as far as understanding any issue, it's pretty garbage. It's pretty garbage. And so I'm using that as a disclaimer going forward, because those of you that are knowledgeable, like me, are going to find this painful, as I'm certainly sure I will find this painful.
There is a tendency to look at slavery as something of the past, but it is estimated that there are today over 27 million people in the world who are subject to slavery, forced labor, sex trade, inheritable property, etc. As those who have been redeemed from the slavery of sin, followers of Jesus Christ should be the foremost champions of ending human slavery in the world today.
Yeah, I too want to end sunlight. I mean, I just hate that it gets in my eyes. We should be a champion of completely ending sunlight. And I'll be honest with you, ending sunlight will probably happen before the end of slavery.
The question arises, though, why does the Bible not speak out strongly against slavery? Why does the Bible, in fact, seem to support the practice of human slavery?
Now, there are answers to this question, and to that question that can be found in scholarship. But I think what it will invariably do, it's going to evolve into a question that is almost distinctly philosophical and theological. The reason why I think the Bible actively regulates slavery and does not abolish it is because God's just smarter than the rest of us, and he recognizes slavery was, slavery is, and slavery always will be. As long as there's been man, there has been slaves. You cannot when you make an omelet, you've got to crack some eggs. And when you want more pie, you got to take a slice from someone else's. No one needs to like this, but that is how the world works. And I just think God has recognized this, and I think we ought to as well.
Slavery in the Old Testament law. Slave ownership was a common practice long before the time the Mosaic Law was given. So the law neither instituted slavery nor ended it. Rather, the law regulated it. It gave instructions on how slaves should be treated, but did not outlaw slavery altogether. The law allowed for Hebrew men and women to sell themselves into slavery to another Hebrew. They could only serve for 6 years, however. In the 7th year, they were to be set free.
So stop right there. That is Exodus 21:2. And he's right. There were slaves that served for 6 years and were released on the 7th. That's absolutely correct. In fact, the Torah prescribes that. Let me go grab my translation of that real quick, the Friedman Torah. So he is not incorrect here. Here's the issue, though. That's not the only form of slavery that was in the Bible. You also have chattel slavery that's in the Bible. People that are brought into slavery that they have no expiration date for their servitude. What he's referring to here in Exodus 21 is debt slavery. If, for instance, you find yourself owing a sum you cannot repay, if you find yourself bankrupt for whatever reason, that you need to sell yourself as if to eat, or you're just that much in debt, you can offer yourself to become a chattel slave for 6 years, and on the 7th you go free. This is so far accurate. But there are also chattel slaves, people that are slaves for indefinite amount of times, not dissimilar from what we see in the antebellum South. And how they are acquired is sort of different from the antebellum South, and also very similar. But let's just let him continue, and I can break it apart for you.
Exodus chapter 21, verse 2. This arrangement amounted to what we might call indentured servitude, and the slaves were to be treated well. Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. Leviticus.
That is Leviticus. Oh, hold on.
Chapter 25, verses 39 through 40.
Let's turn to Leviticus real quick, because I think as one really studies this issue, you're going to find it's not as plain as he wants you to think it is. Let's read. Let's read from 30 to make sure we have it in context. So, here we are. Okay. And if you make sacrifice of thanks to Yahweh, you will sacrifice it so it will be acceptable for you. It shall be eaten on that day. Do not leave any of it until morning. I am Yahweh. And you shall observe my commandments and do them. I am Yahweh. And you shall not desecrate my holy name. So I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. I am Yahweh, who makes you holy, who brought you out from the land of Egypt. Did I read the wrong thing? I thought this is wrong. I apologize. That was there we go. But here's the right passage. And when a man will sell a home in a walled city, then its redemption shall be until the end of the year of its sale. Its redemption shall be for days. And if it will not be redeemed by the completion of a full year for it, then the house in that city has a wall that shall be established permanently for the one who bought it through his generations. It shall not come out in the Jubilee. As for houses in the villages that do not have a wall around them, it shall be figured along with the land's fields. It shall have redemption, and it shall come out of the Jubilee. As for Levite cities, the houses have cities in their possession, and the Levites shall come into internal redemption. And that which one of the Levites will redeem, it shall come out, a sale of a house and of the city and of his possession in the Jubilee, because that the houses of the Levite cities is their profession among the children of Israel. But a field of their cities surrounding the land shall not be sold, because it is an eternal possession for them. Now notice, so far, we haven't got to the relevant passage right yet, but notice how the passage is referring to property, and how property is to be managed, and how it is to be sold on Jubilee years. And when your brother will be so low that his hand is slipping with you, and you shall take hold of him, an alien and a visitor, and he shall live with you, do not take interest or charge from him, but you shall fear your God, and your brother will live with you. You shall not give him your money for interest, and you will not give him food for a charge. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and to give you the land of Canaan, to be God with you. And when your brother will be so low that he is to be sold to you, you shall not have him work as a slave's work. He shall be like an employee, like a visitor with you, and he shall work with you until the Jubilee year. and he shall go out from you, he and his children back with him, and go back to his family, because he shall go back to his father's possessions, because they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold like the sale of a slave. So notice what's going on here. Already in 41, there's an interesting remark here, actually 42, because they are my servants, referring to he who is selling himself into the bondage of another. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. This is referring to an Israelite. Leviticus 25, 39 through 40 is referring to Israelites. These are the people that shall work for 6 years and be free on the Jubilee, on the 7th. Now, they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold like the sale of a slave. So already, the Torah is making a distinction between these slaves that have sold themselves to others as hired workers to pay off debts, to pay off loans, or even to not be impoverished. These are the slaves that are Hebrew slaves, and they're going to be free after seven years. Now, at the same time, they are not to be treated like your other slaves. So right now, already within this passage, the Bible is making a distinction between two classes of people: slaves that work for you for 7 years and the slaves that don't. Who are the slaves that don't? I wonder if Pastor Nelson's going to get into that, because the slaves that aren't working for you for 7 years, well, spoiler alert, they're the chattel. And nobody else, no new people having any questions. So I think we're safe to continue.
The law also specified that when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. The freed slave had the option of staying with his master and becoming a servant for life. See Exodus chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. When the Israelites servant for life, the freed.
Okay, so we're going to replay that here because that's important. So first, we're going to read the quotation he has here, Deuteronomy 15. And at the end of the 7 years, you shall make a remission, and this is the matter of the remission. Every holder of a loan is to remit what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not demand it of his neighbor and his brother, because a remission for Yahweh has been called. You may demand it of a foreigner, but your brother shall remit whatever yours is with your brother. Nonetheless, there won't be any indignant among you, because Yahweh will bless you in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you as a legacy to take possession of. Only if you will listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, to be watchful and do all this commandment that I command you today. When Yahweh your God will have blessed you, he spoke to you, then you will lend to many nations, but you won't borrow, and you'll dominate many nations, but they won't dominate you. When there will be an indignant one among you, from one of your brothers within you, of your gates of your land that Yahweh your God is giving you, you shall not fortify your heart, and shall not shut your hand from your brother who is indignant, but you shall open your hand to him and lend to him enough for his shortage that he has. Watch yourself in case that there will be something good for nothing in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the remission year, is getting close, and your eye will be bad toward your brother who is indignant, and you won't give to him, and he'll call to Yahweh about you, and will be sin in you. You shall give to him, and your heart will not be bad when you're giving to him, because on account of this thing, Yahweh your God will bless you in everything that your hand has taken on. Because there won't stop being an indignant in the land. On account of this, I command you, saying, you shall open your hand to your brother and your poor, and your indignant in the land. Indigent in the land. And when your Hebrew brother or sister be sold to you, then he shall work for you 6 years, and on the 7th you shall let him go liberated from you. And you shall let him go liberated from you. You shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall provide him from your flock and from your threshing floor and your winepress, as Yahweh your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. So notice what's going on here again. This is a Hebrew. This isn't a chattel slave. This is a law governing how Hebrew slaves are to be treated, not how others are to be treated. This isn't the same as other verses that clearly condone chattel slavery. Okay? So those ones we're going to come up to here in a bit, because his next verse is so utterly and clearly, wow, it's misrepresenting. But you'll see.
Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 13 and 14.
Cool, get on with it, buddy.
The freed slave had the option of staying with his master and becoming a servant for life. See Exodus chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. When the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan.
Okay. What did he use there? Exodus 21, 5 through 6. Now, it's really interesting here because although he didn't know it, he touched on some of the sex slavery that is regulated within the Bible. In fact, I know he didn't know it, because if he knew this was regulating sex slavery, he would have stayed far away from it. But we're not going to be like that. We don't sugarcoat things around here. So, this is Exodus 21. And these are the judgments that we will set before them. Yahweh talking to Moses here. Them is the Israelites. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall go out work for 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out liberated for free. This is the Hebrew slave. Now, if you notice, this parallels many passages we've already read, because this is dealing about with the same class of slave. 3, and if he will come by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he is a woman's husband, then his wife shall go out from him. If his master will give him a wife, and she will give to him birth sons and daughters for him, the wife and her children will be the master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the master will say, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go liberated, then the master will bring him over to God and bring him to the door of the doorpost. And his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he will serve him forever. Now, here's the thing. What this is referring to here is sex slavery. Although it's not sex slavery as we know it today. With sex slavery, we typically see this in things like prostitution. The Torah didn't have that. In fact, it was an abomination. But there is still an idea of sex slavery that happens more indirectly. Let's reread. And for those of you that have your Bibles out, pay attention. So, already in 2, we know this is a Hebrew slave because it says so. When you will buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work for 6 years, and on the 7th he will be liberated for free. This is who the slave is associated with, but what continues? If his master will give him a wife, and she will give him birth to sons and daughters for him, the wife and her children will be the master's, and he will go out by himself. Why? Because this man isn't married. This man is an unmarried bachelor who's fallen under hard times. He's been made a slave for 6 years. And if in the course of this 6 years, the master may give him a female slave and to marry, and any slave any child that he has by this woman who is a chattel slave will be the master's. Why? Because the woman, the mother of these children, is the chattel slave. This is referring to a master that has a female chattel slave who he himself cannot actually have sex with because that is not his wife. And so he will simply marry this female slave to a Hebrew slave, and after 7 years, he will go free. Why? Because he's a Hebrew. He's not chattel. He's not a foreigner. But if this man makes an emotional attachment to this woman and to the children they've had together, he has to make himself the property of the master. That's what's going on here. The Bible is regulating what is, albeit indirectly, is nonetheless sex slavery. That's what's going on. When you're reading 21 forward, it's that clear, because understand, they make a distinction. When you will buy a Hebrew slave, okay? Now, if the master will give him a wife, he will give birth to sons or daughters for him. The wife and her children will be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Now, why is the wife and children the master's? Because the wife given to him is the master's, and if he were to go out by himself, the marriage has been divorced then. So the master marries his slaves, produces more chattel slave from them. I think I spit in the camera. That was unfortunate. And once they're the masters, he gets to keep the children. Why? Because they were already the children of his property. That's what's going on here. Is it dirty and ugly? Absolutely. It's slavery. But here's the thing. We don't get to just sugarcoat things and whitewash things because, they're dirty, nasty, filthy, and ugly. And that's exactly what Pastor Nelson here is doing. He is looking at a passage regulating sex slavery. Okay? He is describing a free man by his own choice becoming a permanent slave. But if you read the first 4 verses of Exodus 21, is it really his choice? So, that's the thing. This is whitewashing. This is whitewashing, plain and simple. And when you lie about faith, you betray faith. When you lie about the Bible, you betray the Bible. This is how things are. You don't need to like it, but you don't get to run away from it. Let's continue.
Chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. When the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan, they were to drive out or destroy all the former inhabitants. However, that order was not fully obeyed, and many Gentiles remained in the land. God allowed the Hebrews to take slaves from among that population. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them, you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 44 through 46. So the law did allow for slavery. Several laws regulating slavery appear in Exodus chapter 21. These laws gave some basic rights to slaves and curtailed the actions of masters in a historically unprecedented way. In the ancient...
No, not historically unprecedented. You might want to say it's ethically unprecedented, sure, because ultimately it was the humanity of the slave that was valued in the Torah, but what we see here isn't historically unprecedented in a sense. Because the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Sumerians, well, we don't know about the Sumerians. As far as we know, there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence that dictates what the slave laws surrounding Sumeria were. But a lot of the Near Eastern nations who the Israelites were to buy chattel slaves from were how would I put it? They had very similar laws. Very similar laws. Not the same, but there's enough commonality you can draw parallels.
World outside of Israel, slaves had no rights, but God's law extended to slaves the right to keep a wife, verse 3, the right not to be sold to foreigners, verse 8, the right to be...
So the right to not be sold to a foreigner, that is a reference to a Hebrew slave, not a chattel slave. Chattel slaves were foreigners. By definition, they had to be, and he just read why, because you were to buy your slaves from among the nations that are not Israel. No Israelite is allowed to be a chattel slave except in the family clause as seen in Exodus 21. That is not the same thing. And so now the problem going forward here is that although slaves had rights, okay, they had some rights as well in other nations surrounding them. And it doesn't seem to be as many, but they did exist. It isn't entirely restricted to the Bible. It's not entirely unprecedented in this way. So he's just mistaken here.
Adopted into a family by marriage, verse 9, and the right to food and clothing, verse 10. The law also limited masters in their use of corporal punishment, verses 20 and 26 through 27. Under the Mosaic law, and if economic circumstances demanded it, a Hebrew had the option of selling himself as a slave to a Gentile living in Israel, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47. The law also provided for the slave's redemption at any time, verses 48 through 52.
Really? You know what? Let's read
Also
that.
provided for the slave's redemption at any time of selling himself as a slave to a Gentile living in Israel, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47.
So let's also look at this here. So right now he's referring to slave in a general sense, if I remember correctly. I might have heard him wrong. Let's rewind here just a bit.
Punishment, verses 20 and 26 through 27. Under the Mosaic law, and if economic circumstances demanded it, a Hebrew had the option of selling himself as a slave to a Gentile living in Israel, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47. The law also provided for the slave's redemption at any time, verses 48 through 52. And the treatment.
Well, let's read. And when your brother be so low, and we've seen this already, we've been here, and when your brother be so low with you that he is sold to work for you, you shall not have him work a slave's work. He shall be like an employee, a visitor with you. He will work with you until the Jubilee year, and he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his family. He shall go back to his father's possessions, because they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold like the sale of a slave. You shall not dominate him with harshness, but you shall fear your God. And your slave and your maid that you will have from the nations that are around you, you shall buy a slave or a maid from them. And also from the children of the visitors who reside with you, you shall buy from them and their families that are with you, and from in whom they gave birth to your land, and they shall become a possession for you, and you shall make them a legacy for your children for you to inherit as a possession. You may have them work for you forever, but as towards your brothers, the children of Israel, a man towards his brother, you shall not dominate with him with harshness. And if the hand of an alien or visitor with you shall attain it, and your brother is low with him, and is sold to the alien into the visitor with you, or an offshoot of the alien's family, after he is sold and shall have his redemption, one of his brothers shall redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's sons shall redeem him, or a close relative of his family shall redeem him, or his hand can attain it when he can redeem himself. And he shall figure with one who buys him. In the year he was sold to him, the Jubilee year, the price of a sale will be the number of years. Okay, so pretty sweet deal. If you're the Hebrew slave here, you are not treated this way as a foreigner. You're not. You're not. And this is framed in such a way by Got Questions to really dance around that fact. I gotta say, that's kind of a skill.
Of the Hebrew slave was to be considerate. Slaves were to be treated as workers hired from year to year. You must see to it that those to whom they owe service do not rule over them ruthlessly. Verse 53. If no redemption came, the slaves were still released with their families on the year of Jubilee. Verse 54. New Testament instruction on slavery.
We don't need to worry about that because the New Testament has like 2 verses that deal with the topic that I'm aware of. And they basically just say, yeah, slavery is a thing, it exists. So I'm not going to harp on that almost at all. That's the end of this video for what we need it for our own uses here. Now, here's the thing now. What we see is a tap dancing around the issue that chattel slaves were not free. They did not get freedom on a Jubilee year. They were the possession for a man's children. Okay? Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like the American experience of slavery? Well, because it is. Now, it's not like that completely. There's clearly some derivations between the American slave trade and what we see here. But there are also some consistencies. You would get that with similar practices. Now, next we're going to take on Canon Press. Let's get him up on screen. We don't want that one. Nope. Right here. Let's go. Can everyone see that? Looks like that one person in the audience can see that. All right. Let me know if you can. Let's go.
Welcome to another reaction video. I'm going to be reacting today to Sam Harris talking with Ben Shapiro, and let's go.
Ooh, Sam Harris, that's going to be fun. I've never seen someone that can talk so eloquently and yet be so ignorant of how the actual world works. It's going to be fun.
It is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible.
Let's stop right there. There's a difference between the Bible taking men as they come, which is fallen, sinful, and rebellious, and dealing with certain things that they've developed in their culture, like polygamy or slavery, and setting principles in motion that result in those things being phased out and endorsing. All right, so that's the first thing.
Does it really want those things to be phased out, though? Because I have to say if there's something like polygamy can be condoned, not even say slavery is condoned. But the question is slavery something that the Bible is actually attempting to phase out? In what way? How? Where in the Hebrew Bible? And you can pick anywhere you want. You don't even need the Torah for that. We'll put Dr. Friedman's work to the side for now. We'll put him right underneath here. So, casting aside the Torah, tell me anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, New Testament, Gospels, Epistles, tell me where slavery is being phased out. I mean, I'll wait. And I'm confident in this for one reason. You can't. At no point does the Bible make this leap to saying, well, this is clearly an evil, naughty, bad thing. Let's get rid of it, or at least get rid of it in phases and parts and sections. No. Nothing like that is actually happening within the whole of the Bible, much less the Hebrew Bible. Now, there are certain philosophies posited within the New Testament that make perhaps the abolition of slavery a reasonable philosophy or a reasonable position to hold. Now, I would disagree with that, but you can kind of see the thought process behind abolitionism when you read the New Testament. But I think the answer is much more simpler and much more depressing, to say the least. The Bible has in no ways tried to phase out slavery because it just can't be done. And all of man's attempts to try will just fail. That's something I'm going to save for in the future here, just in a little bit. Give us some time.
explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New.
So in the Old Testament, the slavery that is incorporated into the law is a very different kind of slavery than you had in the Greco-Roman world.
He's right on that. It is very different from the slavery you had in the Greco-Roman world, because the Greco-Roman world didn't really have this thing of debt slavery, or at the very least, it was very rarely ever practiced. And it never really had to be either, because the Romans didn't need debt slaves. They were very successful conquerors, and they could just get slaves from the people that they stomped the crap out of. That's how that worked. You don't need, if like, thing about it is the Romans are the position of, we don't need to breed our own slaves. We can just make some. Watch. That's what goes on there. So for very different reasons, they have very different slavery, but it's also, as we've also seen between the words of the Hebrew Bible, it's also strikingly similar.
In the Greco-Roman world, slaves were simply chattel. They had virtually no rights at all. And in Hebrew slavery, if you go through the law of Moses carefully, you will see that slaves had rights. The slaves had legal protections. In many cases, the slavery was simply a glorified form of indentured servitude. It was slavery for a period of time, etc. So he's flying over this at 30,000 feet and not making necessary distinctions at all.
And you're just as guilty, Mr. Wilson. You're just as guilty. Because what you're referring to would only apply if you were an Israelite, if you were a Hebrew. If you were not in that class and not in that distinction, that wouldn't apply. You would be chattel. Okay? There's no two ways about it. That's what the Bible says. So don't pretend that you're any better here. Where Mr. Harris may be overstating his case, perhaps by intention, you're understating it. Okay? Because what you're describing is not necessarily biblical.
In Greco-Roman slavery, in the New Testament, what you're dealing with is the Christian church entering into a society where slavery was ubiquitous everywhere, and the Christians were interacting with a very sinful institution as it was. And the logic of the New Testament in principle, overthrew all the presuppositions that slavery was grounded on, by teaching, for example, that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, that there was a profound equality before God, regardless of your ethnic background or your class status, slave or free, or your sex, male, female, and so on.
He's correct on that. And this is what I mean, where there are certain philosophies posited in the New Testament that made abolitionism more plausible. Not that it is plausible, I'm not an abolitionist, but it made it more plausible than not. And yeah, that's absolutely correct. Now, the thing about it is, he says this, which I find very interesting. He says the early church was dealing with a very sinful institution, as if implying that the same institution of slavery in the Old Testament wasn't sinful. You see, Mr. Wilson, the definition of a slave is he who is bound by his master in a form of servitude that is unable to leave that service. That's what that means. And if you don't have a choice to leave, it's slavery. Okay? Now, there are other forms of indirect slavery, like in the States, wage employment can often be slavery indirectly in some way, shape, or form, because it has happened in the past, and honestly does happen in the present. But it's not the same thing. You could still, in theory, leave. These slaves here don't get that option, either in the Roman Empire, as presented in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament in the Kingdom of Judah and Israel.
Right, and Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So,
Jesus didn't say that. Paul said that. Now, Jesus, what Paul teaches is consistent with what Jesus did. Jesus interacted, for example, with the institution of slavery when he healed the centurion slave and that kind of thing. But the teaching of Paul is in repeated places in 1 Timothy 6 and in Ephesians and Colossians. Paul is teaching slaves, Christian slaves, and Christian masters how to interact with one another, most famously in the book of Philemon, where he led Onesimus to the Lord. Onesimus was a runaway slave. Philemon was a friend of Paul's. Onesimus had run away from Philemon and presumably had done something like take the family silver or something. Paul comes across Onesimus, leads him to the Lord, and sends Onesimus back to Philemon with an exhortation to receive him as a brother. If you go through Philemon carefully, you will see the Apostle Paul planting all sorts of time bombs in there that overturn the anthropology that pagan slavery rests upon.
Yes, and also no. I mean, because how would I put it? He's leaving something out, which I think is notable, because the abolitionist movement, you kind of appears a bit in the early church. And one of the greatest proponents of abolitionism was Gregory of Nyssa, that had said, because Christ died the death of a slave, that God is closer to the slave than he is to the free, closer to the poor than he is to the rich. And therefore, because these people are more known by God, it is unconscionable that we should enslave them. Now, his philosophies never really came to fruition for one reason, because other Christians rightly pointed out, if we let these people go with absolutely no skills outside of where they're working, they'll starve to death. So it's better for them to be enslaved but alive than free and dead. That was kind of the debates going forth between the 5th and 7th century. And as it turns out, they were right. Now, they at the end of the day, slavery was abolished in Rome, not because there was any legislation that abolished it, but because it just couldn't be practiced. The collapse of Roman power and the Mohammedan invasions around the mid 7th century really put the kibosh on the kind of slave trade that was going around at the time. And so they never really had to deal with legislation actively overriding their place's masters. However, as it turns out, they were also right, because when slavery was abolished in America, or rather chattel slavery specifically was abolished in America, the slaves that had made their lives on the plantation didn't actually leave, not for the better part of a century. And why? Because they were illiterate and knew no other skills except cotton farming. And that's what's going on, and that's what happened for like well over a century. Maybe I'm overstating it, but for the better part of a century, they never really left the plantations. And it's really within living memory that they did. So he's not right, but he's also not wrong. So far, Doug's doing better than I thought he would.
There's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery.
Well, so
because there is no compelling case against slavery. Okay? Who are you kidding? Slavery is one of those prices we pay to have what we call civilization. If your nation and country isn't enslaving somebody, it doesn't exist. It really doesn't. Every civilization and country and people of note that built civilized societies was done so at the expense of a slave class. Even that happens today. The computer, the tablet, the phone you're watching me on was probably built by a slave in China. And they might have even died building it. Who's to say? Slavery today still exists, even here in America. The difference is our slaves are international. They're no longer domestic. We may no longer be whipping our slaves today, but just because we no longer call them racial slurs, and just because they're no longer in the Deep South, doesn't mean they're not slaves. They're still slaves if they can't leave the conditions they find themselves in. And the people that build your iPhones, that build your iPads, that build your cars, they can't leave. So that's still slavery in America today. we are financing and profiting off of the labor and suffering of slaves. And Sam Harris has the ego to think that somehow this isn't clearly the case. It's really mind-boggling the kind of pretzels liberals will twist themselves in to not be guilty of what they desperately want to exonerate themselves of.
For example, even in the law of Moses, when a runaway slave shows up on your doorstep, you are prohibited from returning him to his master. When a runaway slave comes to you, the law of Moses forbade returning him to his master. Well,
wrong. I mean, right, but also wrong, because there is a selection within the Hebrew Bible that prevents you from returning a slave to his master. That refers specifically to Hebrew slaves. If a Hebrew master is beating his Hebrew slave unjustly and treating him harshly so that the Hebrew slave escapes, that slave cannot be returned to the master because he's Hebrew. The same is not actually, am I saying that right? No, I am mistaken. I am dead wrong. I apologize for that. So that refers to foreign slaves, right? If a foreign slave is fleeing from foreign lands, from a foreign master, and comes into Israel, he cannot be returned to his master, okay? But if your chattel slave does the same, if a chattel slave of Israel escapes from his master, there's no law that dictates he can't be returned. So what applies to the foreigner, to the foreign slave, does not apply to the chattel slaves that are direct property of Hebrew masters. So he's not right there. Let's see. Oh, I like this, Diego. Scam Harris. I can't disagree with that. Let's see. Better name for him? I suppose it would be. What about St. Paul's letter to Philemon? I don't know what you're asking about that question, Diego. If you could kind of rephrase that, that'd be best. Because I don't like. There's a lot I could say about Philemon, and it's one of the. And in fact, it's one of the. It is actually an example of ancient humor because there's a joke written within the work. But I don't know exactly what you're asking with that. So if you can elaborate, that'd be great.
That would be just one example.
Because the creator of the universe clearly expected slavery to be a human institution.
Well, except for abolitionists finding enough inspiration in the Bible to use it as their main text.
But they did that despite what's in the Bible.
Well, yeah.
He's not wrong. He's not wrong there. I'm no fan of Sam Harris, but he's not wrong. You see, I don't know who's worse. I don't know if Sam Harris is worse for thinking that he isn't currently a slaveholder, and I don't know if Ben Shapiro is worse for thinking abolitionism is even possible. But neither are actually wrong, because abolitionism was developed out of the philosophical posits that Paul puts in the New Testament. Now, here's the thing. Abolitionism, and especially the Protestant variety, is extremely problematic. And here's why. Because, how about it? When it comes to Catholic abolitionism, I think it's ridiculous because, again, you're trying to abolish something that will never be abolished. But there is a sense in which that you're more justified in abolitionism as a Catholic. And here's why. Because you have numerous church councils and codes of canon law and various writings of church fathers and various other writings of other people, of other ecclesial authorities that you can use to bolster your case. So between using natural law, canon law, the writings of the church fathers, the Bible itself, and various other subsets of literature, you can make a case for abolitionism. And there are notable Catholic figures that did just that. However, Protestant abolitionism is very different. Protestant abolitionism rejects the authority of canon law of the church fathers, or of an infallible authority of church councils. And so they don't have canon law. They have a very low view of the church fathers. They have a very low view of ecumenical councils. And so what do you have? Well, you have the Bible. And around the 19th century, I should say late 18th century, an idea starts to develop, an idea of something called the spirit of the law. Because as Protestant Christians, the only law you have is the Bible, but the letter of that law, what the Bible says, clearly condones and regulates the practice of slavery. And so there came to be a doctrine called, well, okay, yes, the letter of the law says this, but the spirit of the law wants this. So even though the Bible clearly condones and regulates the practice of slavery, we're going to eisegete abolitionism into the Bible and assume the Bible doesn't want us to have slaves. Or at least that is the Spirit of God. That's where the Spirit of God is guiding us. Now, the reason I find Protestant abolitionism even less tenable than Catholic abolitionism, because it is based completely on a crystallization of eisegesis. You cannot use the Bible to be an abolitionist, because the Bible isn't for the abolition of slavery. It's for the good treatment of slaves. And that's a problem when you're an abolitionist. Let's move on. So just to note, Ben Shapiro here is wrong for even thinking abolitionism is possible. Sam Harris is wrong for thinking there is no New Testament philosophies that at the very least point towards abolitionism, or at least something like it. And Doug Wilson, I completely expect not to understand these nuances.
Yes and no. I would have something to say to both of them. There were radical abolitionists, particularly in the United States, before the war between the states, whose abolitionism was their driving motive, and they ignored a lot of what the Bible teaches. But there were abolitionists like the great evangelical hero William Wilberforce, who were motivated clearly by scriptural teaching. So
Which one? Which scriptural teaching? I'll bet $50 over this. Which scriptural teaching advocates for the abolishment of slavery? I'll put money on the table for this. Okay? I'm that confident.
Wilberforce would be an example of the right kind of abolitionism, and then John Brown with his.
Well, the right kind of abolitionism, Mr. Wilson, would be Catholic abolitionism, because although I find it untenable, it actually has sources and foundations of jurisprudence, of conciliar commands, church father writings, and various other things within the deposit of faith that can be used in support of their understanding of abolitionism. You don't have that with William Wilberforce. You have the Bible and nothing more than the Bible, and the Bible doesn't say what you need it to.
Raid on Harper's Ferry would be the kind of abolitionist who was departing from the Bible. So Sam Harris would be right about John Brown. Ben Shapiro would be right about Wilberforce.
I think that is, I mean, I don't want to. This shouldn't sound insulting because it's not meant as an insult. I think that from a religious point of view, that's a simplistic reading of the Bible's role in human affairs. Meaning that when any written document,
go Ben Shapiro,
is given to any group of people, it has to be given to people in a way that they can control. I think that is, I mean, I don't want to. This shouldn't sound insulting because it's not meant as an insult. I think that from a religious point of view, that's a simplistic reading of the Bible's role in human affairs, meaning that
I would agree. I think Sam Harris is boiling down the Old Testament slavery laws to a very I'm looking for a better word than stupid, but to a very unintelligent, let's say, for lack of a better word, point of view, because the Bible is nuanced in how it treats slaves. Like there's at least 2 classes, okay, and in modern times 3. And there's also a specific way it regulates sex slavery. There's also a specific way it regulates the slavery of your fellow Hebrew. So I think, and there's even a clause by which your slaves go free when you give them permanent injuries. I don't think we went over that verse yet, but we might later on. So I agree with Ben on the fact that Sam Harris is quite, what do I want to say, mainstream, in a bad way. Because if you're mainstream, you have no business being an academic.
When any written document,
go Ben Shapiro,
is given to any group of people, it has to be given to people in a way that they can understand. It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible. It's that slavery is universal among human civilization. And
let me stop right.
I'm in genuine shock. I didn't expect that out of Ben. I have to say, I didn't expect that out of Ben. He admitted that slavery was universal to human civilization. The question now I have is, will Ben actually ask my question? Why is it universal throughout all human civilization? Why is that? Because my answer is, it couldn't be any other way. Slavery is like war. We'll never be free of it. But that doesn't stop us from trying to make it as ethical as we can. And that's certainly what the Hebrew Bible is attempting to do. But I did not expect that out of Ben. But let's back up and hear that.
It's given to any group of people. It has to be given to people in a way that they can understand. It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible. It's that slavery is universal among human civilization.
Not endorsed by the Bible. It should say condoned by the Bible. And that's why, although I recommend everyone buy this book as the great piece of scholarship it is, okay, I do not think it should be. I think the main premise it's asking, did the Old Testament endorse slavery, is inherently a philosophical question. And at the risk of copyright infringement, I want to read out the conclusion to kind of demonstrate that. Hey, buddy, what's going on? Take a seat. We'll be here for a little bit longer. Let's continue.
Let me stop right there. Ben Shapiro is exactly right. Slavery has been universal throughout all human history. In the Middle East, it wasn't outlawed until the 1960s in certain Muslim countries, and it's still practiced today in various places. So he's exactly right that slavery is universal. European civilization, Europe and America, had a convulsive reaction against slavery in the 19th century. We fought a war, not entirely over it, but in part over.
No, yes, openly it was over slavery, but I also am more than aware that there is also a nuanced approach to the Civil War, that people were fighting over states' rights as well. But no one can deny that politically, that war was fought over slavery. And there's a reason for this, because, how do I put this? To put how common slavery was, in the midst of the Great Revolution of England, this happened in about early 17th century, a man rose to power in order to stop the kingdom from destroying itself chaotically. That was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell took the reins of power of the English crown, unified the country. And in the midst of the Glorious Revolution, Ireland freed itself from English rule. And so, I can't really put this delicately. So Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland, slaughtered all of the soldiers he could find, and then, in the midst of the war, intentionally torched farms to the ground, basically murdering 40% of the Irish population. Those that didn't die from starvation were enslaved and sent across in the New World, where they either died being worked to death in the New World or on the way there. That's what happened. So slavery all the way back in the 17th century was nothing controversial. It's something you did. Now, here's the thing though. In the 19th century, something started to change from the late 18th century. And what started to change was that slavery became more racialized. Because when Portugal and France and England and Spain had New World colonies, these were tropical regions. And at the time, the slaves they had were white people. And they were typically other Europeans. And as they started to establish themselves, their empires in the New World, they ran into a particular problem that the Europeans that they had enslaved died, as in they were not equipped to deal with the scorching temperatures of Central and South America. And what ended up happening and what they noticed is that the Africans that they had enslaved dealt with the heat no problem. And what culminated from that realization is that it is better to have slavery in the New World that is of Africans than Europeans, because they will live and they won't die because of the heat. That's important. And what happens then is that slavery becomes racialized. And when it became racialized, that's a huge issue. Because when something is racialized, what that implies is that somehow these races, these are now lesser peoples made and built for slavery, something that that sounds more like Aristotle than Christian, because Aristotle had famously said, some people are just oriented better for slavery than others and ought to be enslaved. And that sounded a lot like the sort of slave system we were creating. And what came from that, the abolitionist movement, this convulsion against slavery then, came out because of its racialization. Let's see. Ooh. God doesn't want heretics to be killed. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. Jamie, first of all, the Torah would disagree with you. The early church would disagree with you. Virtually every church father that wrote would disagree with you. Christians, once they gained political dominance, disagreed with you. And even Protestants disagreed with you. What you are describing here is an element of liberalism, not actually something you find in Christianity. Now, I also think this is a mischaracterization. God doesn't want heretics to be killed. He certainly wants them to be persecuted. He certainly wants them to be contained and controlled. He certainly doesn't want their heresy to be made public. That's just the way Christianity has operated. Because the thing about it is, there isn't a single Protestant of the 16th century that wouldn't have you burned at the stake, Jamie. That's honest to God's truth. Now, the heretic can be tolerated in society so long as he keeps his heresy and his errors to himself. Now, you've actually made quite a few comments yourself here. Slavery in America had racial aspects. Well, that was because it was cheaper. In America, you didn't need racialized slavery so much for two reasons. First of all, the native populations of North America were not as obliterated by disease as they were in South and Central America. So you had more pools to choose from that were closer and readily available on site anyway. Secondly, the problem is that as other colonies came to be established, and then the tropical problem came to be solved with the addition of African slaves, it just became easier to buy African slaves from other holders than to just go grab European slaves from across the ocean. So there's that too. Slavery in America had racial aspects merely due to convenience. Let's see. Treating African slaves as not human. That, again, that came as a consequence of the racialization. And so, let's continue on.
The issue of slavery, and Western European civilization outlawed slavery. After Wilberforce was effective in getting the slave trade outlawed in England, the British Empire used their naval might as a way of suppressing the slave trade all over the globe. Now, after Western European civilizations outlawed slavery for the first time massively, the first time on that scale in all of human history, who gets blamed for the practice of slavery as though it were a unique invention of Western European civilization? You guessed right. The people who first outlawed it, who first put a stop to it, are the ones who are blamed for inventing it.
So I take issue with this because, for one particular reason, he makes it seem as if the Western powers just came together and abolished slavery wholesale. And no, they didn't. I mean, that's the narrative, but the truth is much more depressing. What they did is just change the nature of slavery, okay? And you see this in the American experience. Instead of having chattel slavery from Africans, and at this point African Americans, they stop chattel slavery and instead go to debt peonage. And for those of you that don't know what it is, look it up. Debt peonage was a way by which, if you were fined in a way that you couldn't pay the fine, you were incarcerated and you would work until the fine was paid. And you were basically loaned out to a particular business or individual, and you would also pay for your room and board as you were staying as a slave. You would pay for the food he was giving you. You would pay for other amenities. And what ended up happening, all these things compiled to the point where the fine you were given was so overwhelming you couldn't become free. And in some ways, the slavery institution became worse, because by the time abolitionism, by the time 1865 happened and chattel slavery was abolished, before that you could not buy new slaves, not abroad. You had to get them domestically exclusively. And what ended up happening is that as these freed slaves started breaking the laws more, different individuals had very little reason to take care of them, because within the American experience, if you killed a slave, you couldn't get a new one, not easily. And so you had a financial incentive to keep him alive, to not abuse him to the point of death. That incentive was completely removed with debt peonage. More slaves were dying on plantations after the Emancipation Proclamation than at any time before that. And you have debt peonage to thank. And that system wasn't really overturned until 1941, I'm sorry. But on top of that, as time went on, African Americans just started becoming more wealthier as they were introduced to more labor-intensive industries. As they started leaving the plantations and leaving farm abilities, they were able to go from the farms into the factories. Now, this is interesting too. As that happened, many organizations, many companies, and many people lost an ability to use the typical slaves that they would. So what do? You find new slaves. You become inventive about it. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was no shortage of orphans, especially after times of war. And so oftentimes what you would find young children and orphans doing relatively the same work that the slaves would previously do. And then when child labor laws came to be introduced, well, what are we going to do now? Ah, well, that's why God gave us the immigrant. Ah, well, immigration policy is making that harder. What do we do now? We'll just move the slave trade across seas and just let other foreign slaves do our work for us. And here we are today. Nothing really changed. The Western powers never abolished slavery. We just pat ourselves on the back with the lie that we did.
So modern times.
But it was no. There were religions that have different points of view on all these questions, right? So it was possible in the 5th century BC to have a take on ethics with respect to something like slavery or the killing of combatants or non-combatants that was quite a bit more modern and ethical and civilized.
Yeah, name one.
So I got to hear that again. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite paying attention.
No.
Who are blamed for inventing it.
So modern times.
But it was no. There were religions that have different points of view on all these questions, right? So it was possible in the 5th century BC to have a take on ethics with respect to something like slavery or the killing of combatants or non-combatants that was quite a bit more modern and ethical and civilized.
Yeah, no, that's bull. There's no I am desperately trying not to swear here because that just took me for a surprise now that I'm listening to it twice. That is complete bull. No. Nobody had ethics in the ancient world even nearly as comparable to the way we understand the world. Everything from governance to sexual ethics to the rights of man to slavery to various other facets we take for granted today. There is no equivalent in the ancient world. The closest you get comes from the Torah, and that is because of the overall narrative of the Torah of God freeing the slaves. But that's it. Aside from the Torah, which I'm not going to say is exactly like the ethics we have today, because the New Testament did a lot, okay? But there are, in fact, how do I put it? There are no equivalents to the ethics and moral standards we have today. And actually, I would disagree with you, Jim. I will say that metaphysically rights don't exist. I'm not going to deny that. But I'll say rights are a construct invented by the church, essentially. Or at least we have the church to blame for creating them, because it is by rights. It's by rights that we are able to perform moral duties. Rights, as America understands them generally, aren't actually rights. They're just degeneracies. Nobody has a right to be gay. Nobody has a right to be trans. Nobody has a right to an abortion. Rights exist only as so much that they ought to help you perform your moral duties. For instance, if one is doing you wrong, you need free speech in order to hold him to account. If one is oppressing you, if one is oppressing you, then you need weapons to throw your shackles off. These are okay. These are rights that help you achieve your duties and obligations. Rights as they have been known now in the good old US of A, I don't think should be rights at all. And I think Jill was trying to say something here, and I don't know what you're trying to say because that's a letter and not a message. So I'm sure you'll probably put another one in here in a little bit, but let's continue.
Yeah, name one.
I agree.
Golly.
Then is found in the Bible. So I mean, you might not like some of their other commitments, but take something like Jainism, right? mean, Jainism, Gandhi got his nonviolence from Jainism. I mean, Jainism is just, in truth, a religion of peace, unlike.
Yeah, but they don't want to step on a bug. Okay.
Islam, which is the word peace is a euphemism for the word surrender there, or submission. So it's possible for people 2,500 years ago to wake up one day and even write a book which suggests don't harm anyone or anything, even a cricket.
Right. Well, that's fine.
So much for the Jainists, but what about the atheist? Where is he going to get his arbitrary ethic? Don't harm anyone or anything, or don't enslave anyone or anything. How is that produced? I can see how a pantheistic reverence for all life would be consistent with reverencing all life, but how would materialistic atheism get to that conclusion? How would Sam Harris do something more than point to Jainism? How would he, using his premises, derive opposition to slavery? Why would Sam Harris object to it?
That's actually a really good question, and I thank you, Doctor. I don't know if Doug Wilson has a PhD or not. Let's find out here. Well, let's see. Do you have a PhD, Mr. Wilson? Yeah, I'm not finding that out from off the beat. So here's the thing. He's not mistaken on that. The fact of the matter is, Sam Harris is an atheist, a materialistic one. On what standard does he even base morality? Much less a abolition of slavery. Because in his view, the world is nothing more than molecules in motion. Helping a woman cross the street, smashing a child against a pile of bricks, and enslaving a black man are all the same action to him, because they have to be. There's no God. There's no supernaturality. There's nothing above us to establish moral principles or guidance. How would this even? Why is this even an issue to him? Philosophically speaking, of course.
Given his premises, we are all meat, bones, and protoplasm. Why should not some bits of that protoplasm enslave other bits of that protoplasm?
Okay. This was unfortunate. So, Jim, first of all, I don't think I said hi. So, hi, Jim. Second of all, we're going to be engaging Jill here a little bit for a particular reason. He said something that is not actually true. Here. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. So, if I understand Jill's articulation or understanding of this verse, what he means to say is that people that those individuals that are found to have slaves and selling them in order to trade slaves should be put to death. And we're going to show right now why that is false, because Jill was kind enough to make sure to leave Exodus 21 there, and that happens to be where my yod was. So we can read exactly this verse in context. And these are the judgments that you shall set before them. That's 21:16. Let's actually skip a little more, because we read the beginning verses of Exodus 21. We'll start from 7. And if a man will sell his daughter out as a maid, he shall not go out as the slaves go out. If she is bad in the eyes of the master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall not dominate so as to sell her to a foreign people in his betrayal of her. Now, to put this in context, Exodus 21, these first verses are actually regulating sex slavery, an indirect kind, but sex slavery all the same. Now we're going over to how a Hebrew maid ought to be treated, because it is in these verses, I believe, if memory serves correctly, this is a regulation of marriage. And for obvious reasons, marriage and sex are bedfellows. So, he shall not dominate her as to sell her to a foreign people in his betrayal of her. And if he will designate her for his son, he shall treat her according to the manner of daughters. This is a slave, most likely a Hebrew slave, that is being given a trial period by which she will become a wife. Upon becoming a wife, she will be entitled to the full privileges and rights of a Hebrew citizen. Let's continue, though. If he will take another for himself, he shall not subtract from her food, her apparel, and her hygiene, and he will not do these three for her. Then she shall go out free. There is no money. One who strikes a man and he dies, he shall be put to death. And one who did not scheme, but God conveyed it to his hand, I shall set a place for you, and ye shall flee there. But if a man will plot against his neighbor to kill him with treachery, you shall take him from my altar to die. And one who strikes his father and his mother shall be put to death. And one who steals a man and has sold him, or was found in his hand, shall be put to death. So, here's the thing. Where is this applying to? This is applying within the boundaries of Israel. Okay? And one who steals a man, has sold him, or was found in his hand, will be put to death. These are laws for Israelites on how Israelites are to treat each other. In fact, this same book, Leviticus. Leviticus later lays out how you are to get your slaves by getting them from the nations surrounding you. Okay? That's what's going on. Your slaves are taken from the nations around. What the Bible is saying, you cannot sell slaves to each other within Israel, but you can leave Israel and buy them. And you can bring them back with you. And if they escape from you, there is an expectation they will be returned to you. That's what's going on here. So, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. That is referring to slave trading in Israel. That is not a reference to slave trading outside of Israel, because that's where you got your slaves from. And that's precisely why there are regulations on sex slavery on this topic. Because how else are you going to make... Because if you had to go outside of Israel every time you wanted more slaves, that would be rather inconvenient. And so, there's laws governing sex slavery, again, albeit indirectly, within the Bible. That's what's going on. So, there's that. What Jill is putting forth here is correct, but only in a technical sense. Because Jill is of the opinion that there is no such thing as biblical slavery. And for various reasons, I can't buy it. Anyway, thank you. Then I hope I didn't scare you away, Jim, by that. I'm not asking to have discourse with him either. I'm simply debunking Jill here in his biblical illiteracy. Let's put it like that. Okay, I think we're practically gonna end it here, but I want to actually leave off on another note real quick. Thank you. Okay, I'm glad I didn't offend you, Jim. There literally is slavery. First thing I noticed. Nope. Yep. Okay. Let's go. Let's go look at the next video, because this one is actually by Paulogia. And do we need that up? We don't need that up anymore. We'll just get rid of him. Let's see. Yeah. All right. So, for those of you that are aware of the apologetic sphere, I don't think I need to let you know who Paulogia is. I think he should go without introduction at this point. But it features Dr. Joshua Bowen, who again wrote this great book. I'll probably make a proper review of this book later on. I think it is that necessary of a research tool. Let's continue.
God's moral commands. Well, we have a book. Well, if you read the book as a moral guidebook, does that mean we should condemn gay marriage and condone slavery?
Yes. Yes, it does. Because the former one is optional. There are certainly people that don't condemn gay marriage, even though they should. The latter one is what it means to be human. If you exist, if you are a civilization and you're not enslaving somebody or have enslaved somebody, your nation doesn't exist. It's a fairy tale. We as a people, as a human civilization, as humans, require slavery. It is one of the prices we pay to have this thing we call civilization. Again, you don't get an omelet without cracking eggs. This doesn't have to be good. Note this here. I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form slavery is good. What I'm claiming is that slavery is a natural evil of this world and we'll never be rid of it. Ever. That's just the way things are. You don't need to like them, but you need to wake up and smell the coffee.
That's what it says we're supposed to do. I doubt anybody here would condone slavery.
Is that
Speak for
your
yourself.
experience, Dr. Josh? That no one on the internet would condone slavery?
Oh, how I wish that were the case. Unfortunately, this has not been my experience, particularly of late. But this mentality is certainly the one that I had when I started talking about this topic on social media. My thought was, okay, I'll show them that the type of slavery that was endorsed in the laws of the Old Testament was actual slavery. And they will say, oh, well, I need to rethink the way that I'm understanding the Bible. Instead, it is becoming more and more common for me to hear, oh, well, I guess slavery must be moral.
I haven't heard anyone make that argument, because I'm not arguing for the morality of slavery. I don't know if I said that already, but what I am arguing for is that slavery is unavoidable. It's immoral, certainly. Is it necessary? I would argue.
If God's perfect law endorsed it, then maybe slavery in and of itself is not a bad thing to do.
Oh,
Now,
come
this
on.
isn't scientific, but I did a poll around New York, and what people believed about the Constitution.
I don't care what people believe about the Constitution.
Welcome to
It's
Paulogia,
heresy.
where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Today, we're looking at the video behind the video on biblical slavery that has earned nearly 2 million views on YouTube alone. It all stems back to 2015 and a morality debate between skeptic Michael Shermer and Christian apologist Frank Turek. And to help us today, we are joined by the man who literally wrote the book, pretty much 2 books.
I cringe at the name Frank Turek. I'm sorry. This is going to be painful once the introduction's over.
On slavery in the Bible, Dr. Joshua Bowen from Digital Hammurabi.
Yeah, good evening, folks. Dr. Josh here. I'm here to help.
Now, as a Canadian, I found it somewhat
Also, semi-decent Ken Ham, not Ken Ham, but that's a semi-decent Kent Holland impression, sorry. But I guess if you're going to sanitize the Bible, at some point we're going to need to talk about Kenty boy.
odd that they spent so much of a morality debate instead talking about American politics.
When Thomas Jefferson started the nation, he borrowed from John Locke, as you point out wisely in your book, who borrowed from Hooker, who ultimately got it from the Apostle Paul, because it's written on our hearts anyway. You don't need the Bible to know basic right and wrong. Everybody knows basic right and wrong already.
Correct. And this has been, Paul in turn is actually citing from the Stoics, who had a conception of right and wrong within their philosophy. Now, here's the thing. I am of the opinion that slavery violates natural law in a communal sense. It is wrong, for instance, to enslave your family and treat them as slaves. Whether or not it is wrong to do that to others is another question entirely. And while today we can correctly identify slavery as wrong, we've come no closer in any way, shape, or form to abolish it than we have in Paul's day. Now, we're good at renaming it. We're good at sanitizing it and pretending we're not guilty of what we're clearly guilty of, but we've come no closer to abolishing it. And at this point, I don't think we can. That's slavery is what you need. It's one of the prices you pay to have civilization. And the best you can do is find more ethical variations of it. But you'll never be rid of it, not in any meaningful way.
In casual conversation, what most people mean by right is actions that will lead to outcomes they prefer, and wrong is actions that will lead to outcomes they do not prefer. So yeah, everyone has preferences, whether they've read the Bible or not. The question is, do the discussions found in the Bible actually align with the desired outcomes of human flourishing and reducing suffering?
Okay.
Now, that assumes that people want to flourish and reduce suffering. There's no reason why those should be desired outcomes. Now, I will agree that should be the desired outcome of your tribe. For instance, Rome cared about the progress of Rome, that the Roman citizen had enough to eat, that he could revel in the glory of his city, that he could produce strong children into their armies. Did Rome care at all about Jerusalem? Evidently not. They burned it to the ground. And they committed genocide along the way. Okay. Did Romans care about Carthage and their flourishing? Of course not. They burned the city to the ground and salted the earth in and around Carthage and committed genocide along the way. Who are you kidding? The Romans clearly didn't care about reducing suffering. And at the time at the height of their empire, they were the largest slaveholding polity in the world. On top of that, if slaves died, they were of the opinion, we'll just replace them. Do they really care about human flourishing? Is that their goal? Do they want to reduce human suffering? You see, the thing with Paulogia is that this attitude of morality makes sense only if you care about universal human flourishing and a universal reduction of suffering. And there's no rational reason as to why you would want that universally. You'd want that for your tribe, no doubt. Would you really want it universally, though? Rationally, of course. Now, I'm sure you can apply to some form of sentimentality, but that's basically nothing.
Okay, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and
that is basically nothing, assuming atheism
and reducing suffering.
Okay, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and throughout most of the 19th century, most Christians endorsed slavery. Today, none would.
Wish that were true.
So the arguments they made are just like yours. It's objectively correct. It's right. It's good for blacks. It says so in the Bible. It's and so on. They made all these arguments that nobody would make today. Something dramatic happened. Why do you think slavery is wrong now, and why was it okay back 2 centuries ago? What happened? What happened biblically or theologically, or did God have a new revelation to somebody and say, you know what, that was a bad idea?
Wait for his answer. Wait for this dude's answer.
Yes.
Not really a yes or no question, Frank.
First of all, Old Testament slavery was not race-based forced servitude. This is always...
That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Can you leave is the question. If the answer is no, it doesn't need to be race-based. And also, he's not entirely correct. It is race-based in a sense. For instance, if you're Israelite or Jew, you can only be a slave for about 6 years. A chattel slave for 6 years. If you're literally anybody else, you're a slave for good. And you'll be inherited. All right? That's basically race-based. That Jews are, how I'll put it, Jews are exempt from that treatment, but literally no one else is. What would you call that?
It's such an odd thing for people to bring up to me in a discussion about slavery. Old Testament slavery wasn't race-based. Well, setting aside the complicated discussion that accompanies the concept of race, would it really be a win for Frank if the Old Testament endorsed slavery based on some other criterion? As it stands, there was a sharp distinction drawn in several passages between people based on whether they were Israelites or not. For example, in Leviticus 25, the law stated that it was
We've already seen
no
this
longer
part.
the work. You had a land of Israelites.
It was voluntary means of working off debt.
What about this? I'm in a car accident. The motorist is uninsured. You with me?
Yeah.
My car's totaled. And it's all his fault. Now, he has absolutely no money. There is no way that he could pay me. So the judge decrees that he becomes my butler.
Your butler.
Right.
Or keeping captives from mustering a rebellion.
Muster the Gundas.
Yes, much of the slavery that was
Okay, so again, as we already expressed, that was not chattel slavery. That is one side of this issue. The other half is desperately ignored. Notice that. Notice that Frank Turek did not bring up the Bible's regulation of sex slavery. Notice Frank Turek did not bring up the Bible's the Bible's explicitly telling you that your slaves, your chattel slaves, come from nations around you. Notice that. There's a reason.
was practiced in the ancient Near East, including in the laws of the Old Testament, was ultimately considered voluntary. How does that play out? I mean, look at 2 Kings 4:1. Now a woman from the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, has died,
Let's go
and
find more
you know
Turek.
that your servant was one who feared Yahweh." Now the correct slavery was to keep down future rebellions is simply not in the text.
Secondly, slave trading is condemned in the Bible, both in the Old and the New Testaments.
The two passages.
No, that is not. Well, you can argue in the New Testament, especially in the writings of Paul, but definitely not in the Old. And the last one there teaches that all are made in the image of God, slave and master equally human, protected, and one in Christ. Okay. Yeah, I agree. The master and the slave share a shared equal human value before Christ as judge of the universe. Does that mean the slave is now the master? Does that mean the slave can just say, "Yeah, I don't feel like it"? Like, can he be SpongeBob in that one episode where he resists the orders of Plankton? Are we living there now? Seriously? Okay. Let's go.
Institution of slavery.
Nor does God, slave and master are equally human, protected, and one in Christ. That's throughout both Old and New Testaments.
That's a strange place for the crowd to go wild.
I would agree. Okay. We doing anything? I think that's the last place that. No, that is not the last place they bring up Frank Boy. Right here. There you go.
Could be his slaves. This type of general statement about setting captives free has nothing to do with the social institution of slavery.
I agree.
And fifth, the Bible's main goal is spiritual redemption, not social reform.
Okay. So, what are you doing there then? if the Bible's main goal is redemption and not social reform, what would this topic even matter to you? I'm genuinely curious, because if the Bible's main goal is redemption, not social reform, why are you arguing that slavery in the Old Testament wasn't that bad? Why are you even having this debate? Okay.
The Bible,
Christians justify
slavery,
Let's see this.
which it emphatically does not.
Christians justified slavery using the Old Testament. My
Yeah, and they would have been correct in doing so.
point is, you can't.
Also, that you don't need to justify slavery. I don't need to justify that I have hair on my head, or that I'm sitting down right now, or the sun has set. I don't need to justify these things. They just are. I don't need to justify slavery. It just is. Okay? Things that are don't need to be justified. They just need to be accepted. Okay? So I don't need to justify what is clearly a part and in the fabric of reality and human existence itself. I don't need to justify that men go to war. So I'm of the opinion I don't need to justify slavery at all. Slavery is part of us, whether we like it or not.
Be getting your morals from the Bible, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing you don't. It is not a good book.
Michael, the only reason you have morals at all, or even a standard of morality, is because of the Bible. Okay? So get an education and shut up.
It is not. It is filled with embarrassingly bad commands
Michael-
that nobody today would obey.
Michael,
So what you've just seen is a spin doctrine of Scripture. Oh, they don't really mean slaves. They mean housekeepers. They were well kept. Well,
I agree with this one. I agree with that one, Michael. You're absolutely right. Frank Turek is notorious for trying to sanitize the Bible.
baloney.
If you want more insight into the spinning of scriptural slavery takes into baloney, then you should check out Dr. Josh's second edition of his brilliant book, Did the Old Testament Endorse
Yeah.
Slavery? What's new in this second edition?
Well, it is gone.
We don't. I already know in the second edition, but I recommend everyone get it. I recommend everyone. Let's see. Oh, you made a comment here, there, dude. Can we be redeemed if we rebuild a society that is antithetical to God? Absolutely not. No. Then the Bible is conformed with social reform. If that is how you are going to, if that's what you understand if that's what you understand to be by social reform, then I agree with you. I just don't think Frank Turek means the word in the same way that you're referring to it, Jim. I know I do. I just don't think Jim does. I'm sorry. I just don't think Frank does. And so I would say that we can't, that we will be redeemed by Christ, through Christ and by Christ. And in so doing, that ultimately will lead to a state that is not antithetical to God. And so at that point, social reform should be considered. That being said, I'm relatively sure that's not what Frank means here. Anyway, we're just about done here. So, at the risk of copyright infringement, I want to read one more thing here. And it's going to be from Dr. Bowen's book. And I wanted to read the conclusion at the risk of copyright infringement, because I don't want to do so, but I think it is so important that we actually go over this, because I think Dr. Bowen, in a significant way here, goes above his profession. He moves outside of his lane. First of all, I'm going to be skipping a couple of about the first 3 3/4 of a page for one reason, because he goes into detail over what was covered, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody because this is just very good work. Anyway, so I'm reading from later on. In the end, it is clear that slavery was not only condoned in the Hebrew Bible, but from legal stipulations in place demonstrate that the authors endorse the practice. Is that really so? Let's look at this. From the beginning of the conclusion, he says, so, was slavery endorsed? Perhaps one of the most common questions I hear concerning slavery in the ancient world is, does the Old Testament condone or endorse slavery? To condone something generally implies allowing something that is considered to be immoral. To endorse, however, frequently carries the idea of publicly supporting or approving of something. One of the goals of this book was to demonstrate that the Hebrew Bible and its laws contained therein did endorse slavery. To demonstrate this, we not only had to determine that slavery was a reality of the Hebrew Bible, but the Old Testament established laws for its appropriate practice. And that's what he goes over from chapters 1 through 7. So I have to ask, is the regulation and laws of its appropriate practice enough to cement an endorsement? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. For one reason. For something to be endorsed, there needs to be a positive moral aspect to it, where it is being posited as, yes, you ought to do this. For instance, when you look at what the Torah, when you look at what the Torah has to say about marriage, it clearly paints it in a positive light. It clearly paints it in a benefiting light, both to the man and to the woman. It clearly paints it in a positive affirmation. Does anything like that exist with slavery? Is there any way slavery is framed by which it's clearly this good, positive thing? I don't think so. I don't think so. And there are a few reasons for that, mainly because the narrative of the Torah itself seems to kind of grind against that understanding. So, in the Anchor Bible's dictionary is entry on slavery concerning the purchase of slaves from neighboring nations. Domenius writes, the source in every possible way encouraged by biblical instructions. Was it encouraged, though, or just described? That's a different question. Such slaves were legally considered the absolute property of the owners, no disagreement there, and their status was permanent, no disagreement there. They were sold, passed on by inheritance, pawned and branded and marked like livestock. Absolutely, no doubt. Slavery was not endorsed arbitrarily, as it was part of the common economic system that existed in ancient Israel and the wider Near East long before the biblical period. That exists now. That really exists now. No change there. Debt, chattel, and sex slavery were also part of the Mosaic Law, and regulations on their practice in the text are generally on par with other legal systems in the region, both synchronically and diachronically. The nature of the slavery in the laws of the Hebrew Bible is not only agreed upon by scholars of the field, but most of what we covered in this book is not even debated in scholarly circles. I agree, and I say this as an undergrad, just getting his feet wet in it. When you really look at what people are saying about the Bible, things like was biblical slavery all that bad, or young Earth creationism, or literal interpretations of the Bible, these don't even come up in conversation. Okay, these are beyond dispute. Let's see. Okay. The various legal texts, including those of the Hebrew Bible, make specific provisions for its practice in the hopes that it would be carried out appropriately. Again, does that equate to endorsement? In some ways, to debate the endorsement of slavery in the Hebrew Bible would be akin to asking, did the Old Testament endorse killing people? Of course it does. Really? I'm relatively sure that that murder is met with a capital punishment in the Torah. I could have read that wrong, but I have reason to believe my eyes didn't lie to me there multiple times. Okay, of course it does. However, there are restrictions and provision in the law that ought to ensure people don't kill or be killed under certain circumstances. Example, as punishment for a crime during a time of war. These laws approved of killing other people in the specific contexts. Well, if you mean killing that generally, then yes. But if you mean slavery that generally, sure. But did the Bible endorse slavery as a particular moral practice? No. In the same way, it's not endorsing killing in any stripe as a moral practice, but merely a punishment, something that has to be done, not something that's necessarily good. Okay? That's thoroughly consistent throughout the Hebrew Bible. I had a conversation with a Christian apologist in which the topic of slavery in the Old Testament came up, as it always does. In typical fashion, the apologist argued what have become accomplished arguments that attempt to defend slavery in the Bible. It wasn't race-based. They had to be set free after a set time period. Even those that weren't set free had it better than slaves that were owned in the nations in and around Israel. As you might expect, I spent some time dealing with these arguments, addressing either their nuances of their positions or problems with the data that they were presenting. At what point, however, I just stopped and asked them a question that took them somewhat by surprise. Therefore, what? In other words, the apologist had meant to make a series of claims that may or may not have been accurate, but what was their point? There's an incredible apologist online, or an incredibly popular apologist online named Frank Turek, who we saw briefly, who regularly presents arguments against slavery in the Old Testament. On his cross-examined website, using arguments similar to Turek's, a contributor presented the following 8 arguments against slavery in the Old Testament in an article entitled, "Does the Bible Promote Slavery?" 1. Slavery was pervasive throughout the entire ancient world. 2. God outlawed the slave trade. 3. Slavery was more like indentured servitude. 4. Masters couldn't harm their slaves. 5. Slavery was only for 7 years. 6. Runaway slaves received safe haven. 7. Slavery was not God's ideal. 8. The full personhood of slaves. The reader likely feels prepared at this point to in the book to address whether most of it, if not all of it, of the arguments made by the author. And he's right. He's absolutely right. You can definitely push back on all of these. Arguably not number 8, the full personhood of slaves. Personhood in so much that he is that theologians of the Torah, both in modernity and in ancient times, agree that he was made in the image of God, but his full personhood was recognized if theologically, not legally. And you can get more nuance in the book that actually parses that out more, which I won't go into here. The reader, however, I believe that there is an overarching issue that goes unnoticed. We can get so caught up in defeating the argument set forth by apologists that we miss another important point that can be revealed by simply asking the question, therefore what? More precisely, we might ask, let's assume all this is true. Now what? Where do you go from here? What could the apologist say? Let's take a couple of the above points and try to predict what they might say in that question. Slavery was pervasive throughout the ancient world. Therefore, what? Well, Israel was just doing what everyone else is doing in the ancient world, so they're no worse than other nations. Where does that get you? Well, God outlawed the slave trade. Okay, therefore what? Well, God said that they couldn't sell slaves on an open market or travel or acquire slaves to foreign nations and bring them back to Israel. Okay. Look, slavery was more like indentured servitude. Therefore what? Well, they weren't actually chattel slaves that were owned for life. They were debt slaves that were under contract that had to be released after 7 years. Okay, what? So what? Even if you are correct, please explain to me how these explanations make the practice of slavery moral. And he's absolutely right. Dr. Bowen knocked this out of the park here, which is why I figured I had to read it, because this is a problem I see with so many apologists. Both the Thomas Holwigs of the world, the Jesus is Lord, or Jill here, the Frank, did I mention Frank Turek? I think. The Frank Turek's, Thomas Holwigs, Jesus is Lord, all of them, they are basically making these defenses without any precise or particular reasoning by which they are. And that's concerning, because they're not actually thinking these arguments through. And that should be a concern to the theologian, to the philosopher, to those that actually want to abolish slavery, okay, that's a problem. Here, Jill made this. We've already seen this. Whoever steals a man and sells him, anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Jill is clearly posting this as an argument that slavery wasn't in the Torah. That's just not true. That's just not true. But notice what he's doing. He is approaching this issue and sugarcoating the Bible, sanitizing it to make it seem like something it is not. But let's just say that it's true. Let's just say that taking this in its most broadest context possible, whoever steals a man and sells him, so any form of kidnapping, and anyone found in his possession of him shall be put to death. Does that make the Bible's use of slavery, indentured servitude or otherwise, any more or less moral? I don't think it does. I don't think it does. Now, let's continue. Yeah, when you grant the premise for the sake of argument and simply ask the question, therefore what, you will find that what follows is often simply an attempt to justify slavery. Now, again, I don't think I need to justify slavery for reasons I've already particularly said. And whatever else might be true of slavery in the Old Testament, it was still slavery. So if someone says, well, it wasn't slavery like in the antebellum South, where they weren't allowed to beat them to death, it might be useful to respond to like, yes, finish that thought. What do you conclude from that? It seems to me, therefore, that the question before us should not be, did the Old Testament endorse slavery? Instead, I think it would be more profitable to ask, how should we understand the biblical text in the God of the Hebrew Bible in light of his endorsement of slavery in the Old Testament? And again, I don't see a reason by which we should interpret this as endorsement. He's condoning it, that's for sure. Nobody that is familiar with the scholarship is going to deny that. But does this qualify an endorsement? I don't think it does. To be sure, many people have sought to exaggerate the nature of the Old Testament slavery in an attempt to argue for a particular point of view. At the same time, many others have downplayed the reality of slavery in the Hebrew Bible, making it out as if it is nothing more than a person owning a credit card or working in a fast food restaurant. Hold on. Yeah. However, neither position is correct and neither position is necessary. One can be a Christian, for example, despite his endorsement of slavery in the Old Testament. And at the same time, one not need to exaggerate the details of Old Testament slavery and laws in order to combat faith in the biblical text. The reality of the practice will most likely suffice. It has been my goal to demonstrate as accurately and possible as I can that the laws concerning the practice of slavery were as described in various passages of the Hebrew Bible, arguing that it was endorsed in the legal system. I often say that it was not my intent to show the God of the Old Testament to be a big meanie, that has quotes in it, or to characterize him as a type of moral monster. Instead, my hope is that the reader will view the Old Testament slavery laws and the legal traditions with which they accord as a product of their own cultural milieu, and that the morality seen in the biblical text that the morality as seen in the biblical text can be taken not as prescriptive laws that must be followed throughout human history, but as texts that described actual or theoretical practices in the ancient world. Okay. And it's an incredible read right here. I recommend everyone pick this book up because it is a one-stop shop handbook for not only slavery as it is seen in the Old Testament, but throughout the whole ancient Near East. Okay. So I'm going to entertain Jill here just a little bit. Then we're going to be getting on here. Okay. The contract, called an indenture, may be entered voluntarily. Sure. For purported eventual compensation or debt repayment, or may be imposed involuntarily as judicial punishment. No doubt. Indentured slavery is not slavery. Read Praise's book. I disagree with Thomas Hollweg's premise. I absolutely disagree with it. even when it is forced in the case of prison, is not considered slavery, but punishment for a crime. That's still slavery. Now, you can justify that form of slavery in a moral sense, sure, but that's still slavery, albeit you might have chosen to be there due to a crime you've committed. That's still slavery. And so you can probably disqualify that kind of slavery. That's not what we're referring to when we're talking about slavery, Jill. We're talking about chattel slavery, in which you can be worked and never be released, in which your very children are organized by the master and you cannot leave. That's what's going on here. And so when it comes to indentured slavery, that's still slavery. Okay? Indentured slavery is still slavery. If you cannot leave, it's slavery. Okay? And so right now, today in U.S. prisons, you can be put to work against your will. And guess what? Even though it's lawful, and to a great degree, I would argue moral, sure, it's still slavery. I'm not saying that slavery didn't happen in the Old Testament. My question is, did the Bible promote chattel slavery? That's basically the question that Dr. Bowen is asking. And the answer is, well, he condoned it. Okay? So when Dr. Bowen and myself and others are using slavery, we're not using it in the same terms, light, or way by which you are, Jill, because you're trying to use terms and definitions which sanitize what's going on in the Bible. And you shouldn't do that. You're betraying Christianity that way. At the end of the day, the Bible clearly condones chattel slavery, slaves that are enslaved to work for a master and a family that cannot leave. That's slavery. No matter how you want to spin that, that's slavery. And the fact you have to spin that using different semantics on words, my dude, it's kind of telling. I'm just going to say it. Let's see. I agree. Without God, all things are permissible. With God, without God, all things are permissible. With God, shut up and listen. I don't know who you're referring to that to, Rez. I don't know if you're referring to it to me or Jill here, but I'm tentatively agreeing. Without God, all things are permissible. I forget who said that. But I would definitely agree without a God substitute. Without God or a God substitute, that's certainly the case. Because there are other religions of the Far East that are atheistic, yet they have a sense of objective morality. But that's not for neither here nor there. Okay, let's see. Joe plays fast and loose with terms. He runs a Mott and Bailey. Yeah, that's true. I've seen Vosh do that as well. Okay, one last time. We're using the term the way the Bible uses it. No, you're not. No, you're not. Because if you were using it the way the Bible was using it, you would be using 3 different types of slaves: debt slaves, chattel slaves, sex slaves. Okay? That's how you would be using those terms. Because that's the way academics use the terms. That's the way Dr. Joshua Bowen uses those terms. That is not how the Bible uses these terms. Okay? Because you're intentionally not defining them. That's a problem. And so, when you were a debt slave, I agree. I agree with you 100% on this, Jill. You are a slave for 6 years, released on the 7th. That's still slavery. And when a Hebrew noble goes into the nations and in amongst his region and buys slaves from their markets and takes them back into Israel, that's still slavery. And when the master organizes the male slave and the female slave to bear children, which will also be his slaves, that's still slavery. Okay? Now, if you were trying to use the terms the way the Bible uses it, you would make these distinctions because the Bible certainly is. Okay, we're using the term the way the Bible uses, not the way the Roman Catholic Church does. So I think that is I think that's a pathetic insult against me. I think I could be wrong on that, but if it is an insult, you gotta do better, my bro. Indentured servitude is not chattel slavery. Never said it was. No scholar would agree. They certainly wouldn't. The Bible allows for servitude is not condoning slavery or for servitude. Tell that to the slaves you can buy on foreign markets then. Okay? Because we read that, Jill. I think you were here for that. That's right in here. Leviticus 25. Okay? Tell that to the slaves that can be born into chattel slavery that is seen in Exodus 21. You were definitely here for that, Jill. Okay? Don't tell me you weren't. Let's see. You have to ignore the way the Bible defines slavery to come up with this nonsense. So the Bible is nonsense then, because I read that right out of the Bible. Jill, you're not. If this is your opinion, you don't actually believe the Bible. You believe in the word of Jill, not the word of God. Okay? And the word of Jill says, I can read into this whatever I want, when I want to. And that's just not, I'm not on that train, my friend. Jill is sad for the excuse. Okay. Well, I'm not going to say it. I don't want to, I'm just going to let that be there. Let's see. Dr. Josh, oh man, have fun. Well, you know what, Jill? God bless you and good night. You have a good night, my buddy. So, that's going to be the last time on this stream, at least, that I'm going to be entertaining Jill. With that being said, everybody, this is the Pale Galilean. Well, thank you for this installment, and I'm leaving on with a relatively sizable audience. 4 people are here. That's good. So, what have we learned? What we have learned is that the Bible, this one right here, and the rest of the Hebrew Bible clearly condone slavery. Okay? That should not even be a topic of debate. And I want apologists everywhere. Obviously not Jill. He wants to eisegete this. But everybody else should be reading the Bible and simply accepting these things because they are true. The Bible clearly condones slavery. The research on this is exhaustive. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with condoning slavery. Why? Because while slavery itself is immoral, and let that stand, slavery is immoral, there's literally nothing we can do about it. It has been with humanity and universal in humanity for time immemorial. We had slaves in the past. We have slaves right now in the present, and we will have them in the future. It's one of the prices we pay for civilization. And as evil as slavery is, so is war. So is a lot of things. I don't see anybody trying to justify war. Okay? And there's a particular reason. You can't justify war as much as you just accept it. In the same way, you cannot justify slavery as much as you just accept it. The fact of the matter is, what goes on in the slave trade is happening now. I've taught about this earlier on in the stream. If you guys want to go around back there, I think it's going to be at the between 50 minutes and the 1 hour and 20 mark, if people are interested. The fact is, what goes on is that we have slavery in the past. We have slavery now, even in America. And America is one of those countries that pride itself on being abolitionist, and no, we're not. No, we're not. We just moved the practice away from sight. It was ugly to us. So here's the thing. Back in ye olden days, around 1820s, people like Jill were enslaved. African Americans were enslaved. And we called our slaves racial slurs. They worked in generally southern states. And they were in the and they were what do I want to say? And they worked on plantations most of the time. All right. Today, slaves are Asian. We call them industrious laborers, and we move them to the factories across the oceans where we don't have to see them. That's it. This computer I'm streaming this on was built by a slave. The phone, which I have around here, probably built by a slave. These clothes I'm wearing, probably sewn by a slave. These things are all from China, all of them. And China is the largest slave economy in the world at the moment, followed closely by India, or it might be the other way around. But one way or another, we're getting the majority of our goods from a slave economy. Human suffering has gone into what we are buying. We're responsible. We finance slavery with our own dollars. Every time you buy a car, every time you buy a cell phone, every time you buy the clothes for your back, you are legitimizing and financing the practice of slavery because you can't otherwise. What are you going to do? Move all the trade down to South and Central America? Now, to be sure, that's, I think, what we should do. Why? Because the people there will be financially obligated to stay in their jobs. Okay? So it comes down to this. If we were to move all of our trade somewhere else, say to Africa, they're still using slaves and possibly worse slave labor and worse slave conditions than the Chinese ones are having right now. If we move all our slaves down south to our backyard, Central and South America, you'll run into the same problem because what goes on down there are sweatshops, and it's not slavery in the most wooden sense of the word. You can leave, but the alternative to that is poverty. And that's slavery, albeit indirectly. Is it good? No. Is it more ethical than what we currently have is set up with slavery? Absolutely. Absolutely. It is better for all our labor to go to sweatshops than it is to go to the Chinese factories. There's not a doubt about it. I don't know how to message you, Jamie. I am aware that I have your emails. If that's what you mean, I'll do that. Okay. War mobilizes a nation. Oftentimes, war will get people out of a desperation and cause revivalization. Just look at World War II USA. Yeah, I have. And okay. Does the mobilization of a nation somehow outweigh the human carnage fought in battles? I don't think it does. Does the desperate situation it gets out of justify two men going into a field of the battle, one gunning the other down, and the other coming home alive or maimed? I don't think it does. Now, to be fair, I think it was a moral thing to put the German Reich to rest and the Japanese Empire down. I think it was a moral thing to do that. It doesn't make the use of war, however, suddenly a moral practice. No. And I think that is a major problem we see in a lot of American politics. Okay? Because if war can be justified in this way to mobilize a nation, then I see no reason why we cannot murder a child in the womb if it means a mother can survive. Okay? If things are evil, they are evil, they are evil, they are evil. Not that they are the worst kind of evil, mind you, but there is a moral culpability that comes attached to them. And yeah, I remember Diego, absolutely. I remember the Cristero War, and I think the Cristeros were justified in their actions during the war, but I'm not going to call those actions good, because taking arms and intentionally killing your fellow man should never be a good thing. It may be a necessary thing. It should never be a good thing. and should never be painted as that. Trent Horn actually did a recent video on that on the Council of Trent. And one thing that was said on the Council of Trent is that even if the U.S. campaign against Japan and what they did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki could have ended the war in a much quicker way, which I have no reason to doubt that, but assuming it could do that, does that justify the termination, the vaporization of about 300 to 500,000 people? I don't think it does. Because if something is a war crime, it's a war crime, and we shouldn't justify evil in this way. We should acknowledge that this thing was evil, this thing was a war crime, it happened, but and I agree, there can be a justified war, Diego, no doubt about that, but I don't think there can be any, exactly, we're on the same page then. War is not going to be moral, correct. So, with that, this has been another installment of the Pale Galilean, signing out. We've gone over quite a bit of material on slavery, and I hope by now I've exhaustively explained to everyone and to the audience that showed up why slavery is in the Bible, and that this should not be pussyfooted around. This should just be accepted. Okay? So for all of you, for all the Jills out there trying to say slavery isn't what it clearly is, just take the L, my dude. Just take the L and let it go. And continue your Christian walk. Though from what I hear, I don't know if Jill himself is a Christian. So in that case, if that is the case, that can go for everyone else. All right? Okay, this is your host Pro of the Pale Galilean, signing out. Viva Cristo Rey, everybody. Pray the rosary. Have a good day. See ya.